Today's headline is Disasters on the River. Exciting tales of the Mississippi recalled by last event. The subheadline says, He played ball by ear. Earlier accidents often due to the passion for racing. History of the first river steamboat and pioneer reminiscences. This article originally came from the Chicago Chronicle. It says the loss on Sunday night, May 12th, at Brunkhorst, Illinois, of the steamboat City of Paducah was the only serious disaster of the kind that has occurred on the Mississippi River since 1887. October 3rd of that year, the steamboat Carolina exploded her boiler, causing the burning of the boat and the destruction of 22 lives. She was not racing when the disaster befell, which fact put it in a different case from most of the explosions that in past times have occurred on this river. The cause of the disaster to the city of Paducah was the running against a snag, a cause which boatmen on the river have always been familiar with. Snags are the roots and stumps of trees that have been torn from submerged banks in times of flood and sunk in mid-river. They have in most instances of steamboat loss been run against when the unfortunate boat was making speed, either up or down the stream. In the instance of the city of Paducah, the fatal snag was projecting from the shore. It was a singular accident in some respects. Boats had stopped at that point every week for years, but never till the other day did a boat stern swing against the shore in a way to strike the snag and tear out its side. This latest steamboat disaster on the Mississippi cannot rank among any but the smaller happenings of the kind on the Great River, but it will serve to recall to many people the accounts of terrible disasters of steamboats and their passengers. Since and including 1837, there have been 43 terrible disasters of the kind. October 29th of that year, the Monmouth exploded its boiler and became a total wreck. It had on board 480 Immigrant Creek Indians, 234 of whom were drowned. Shortly after, the General Brown ran upon a snag and sank, losing 60 lives. The DeSoto, November 15, 1844, collided with the Buckeye and lost 60 lives. In 1849, the Louisiana, while racing, exploded its boiler and lost by burning or drowned 100 lives. June 13, 1858, the Pennsylvania raced and exploded, losing 100 lives. Later in the same year, the Ben Lewis exploded while racing and lost 35 lives. June 24, 1860, the Miami, just after it had left Cairo, exploded its boiler, killing in the fire or water 150 passengers. Near the same place, a little below Cairo, October 27, 1869, the Stonewall burned in broad day, causing the loss of 200 passengers. The whole number of the lives that were lost in the 43 terrible steamboat disasters is 1,760. This number does not represent probably 1/4 of the actual total of the losses of human life in the hundreds of minor accidents on the Father of Waters in the last 60 years. The earliest mention of steamboats as being in use on the Mississippi River occurs in the reminiscences that were collected in the Mississippi by T.B. Thorpe. The first steamer that ever appeared in this river was built at Pittsburgh by Fulton and Livingston and launched in March of 1812. It steamed down the Ohio and the Mississippi to Natchez, where it loaded with passengers. After running for some time this newly established trade and meeting with a variety of misfortunes, it finally was sunk, losing 15 lives. In 1850, the river, from an unusual drought, shrunk within its banks to a comparatively small stream, and as a consequence, under the protection of a high bank nearly opposite the town of Baton Rouge, there was exposed the wreck of a small boat, the timbers of which, so far as could be ascertained, were in a good state of preservation. No one particularly noticed the object, because such evidences of destruction form one of the most familiar features of the passing scenery. Yet there was really an intense interest connected with these old timbers, for they were the remains of the steamboat that was built by Fulton and Livingston in 1812, the first that ever appeared on the Mississippi. In 1813 to 1814, two more boats, the Comet and the Enterprise, came down the Ohio River into the Mississippi. The Enterprise proceeded as far as New Orleans, where it loaded with sugar and cotton, and returned up the river in triumph. It was the first steamboat that ever made the trip from New Orleans to Pittsburgh. From New Orleans, it reached Louisville in 25 days and was greeted with a public demonstration. Triumphal arches were thrown across the streets, and every evidence of enthusiasm was manifested. Public speeches were made, magnifying the event, which was deemed to be the accomplishment of all that was possible in inland navigation. Before that time, the ascent to the river in keel boats had occupied 100 days. These phases of Western life have entirely passed away, but they're interesting in the descriptions that are left of them. The same letter writer from which the above paragraphs are taken encountered on his boat an original pioneer who went by the name of Bob Lawton, and who, after he had drank heavily one night, delivered the following oration. Gentlemen, what is poetry but the truth exaggerated? Here it can never arrive at any perfection. What chance is there for exaggeration in the great West, where the reality is incomprehensible? A territory as large as classic Greece annually caves into the Mississippi, and who notices it? Things to be poetical must be got up on a small scale. The Tiber, the Seine, the Thames appear well in poetry, but such streams are overlooked in the West. They don't afford water enough to keep up an expansive duck pond, would be mere drains to a squatter's preemption. I have heard of frontiersmen who were poetical because their minds expanded beyond the surrounding physical grandeur. Books are not yet large enough to contain their ideas. Steam is not strong enough to impress them on the historic page. These men have no definite sense of limitation, know of no locality. They sleep not on a couch, but on government lands. They live upon the spontaneous productions of the earth and make a drinking cup of the mighty Mississippi. Settlements within 50 miles of them occasion the feeling of overcrowded population, and they are obliged, if they would exist at all, to penetrate more deeply into the forests. They have an instinctive dread of crowds. With them, civilization means law and calomel. The collector of these reminiscences, when 100 miles above New Orleans, chanced upon a strange character who went by the name of Squire Blaze. In his little settlement, he kept a grocery and a whiskey bar. In his early life, he had served for a long time as first mate on a raft, such a raft precisely as Abraham Lincoln once navigated on the same river, but he became ambitious to get employment on a stern wheeler. At length, he got to be captain of that kind of craft which was in the fuel business. In the pursuit of this business, he sometimes got so far up the river that he was clean out of the way of taxes. His pride was to be called captain, his ambition to run a race. Circumstances occurred in which he could race, and his description of what happened is worth reproducing here. I was coming downstream, he said, with a full head of steam on, when I overtook the squatter Bell, loaded like myself with pine knots. The race was exciting. The steam yelled and the hands swore. You'd thought that all the universe was pounding sheet iron. 'Twas no use. I was always a misfortunate man. The Fairy Queen's engine, that was my boat, had light weight on the safety valve, and the furnaces got choked with rosin. The squatter Bell was getting ahead. Twice I raised my rifle to shoot her pilot, for you see, I didn't like to be beat, when I smelled something warm, and the next thing I knew, I was lodged in the limbs of a dead cypress, 32 feet 6 inches from the ground. This was the proudest moment of my life. I afterwards got a painter to draw the scene, and when the picture was finished, I chopped out a frame for myself. What grieves me, continued Squire Blaze, is that my title of captain didn't stick, and I've been called Squire ever since. That is a pretty good description in plain prose, but there is a description in verse that beats it. It was written by the distinguished man who was chief in President McKinley's cabinet, none other than the Secretary of State, John Hay. His poem is called Jim Bludso of the Prairie Belle. Notwithstanding the frequency of accidents to the boats, racing was grand sport, and when it came about that the laws restricted each boat to just so many pounds of steam to the square inch, much of the danger was removed. In the flush times, a steamboating a race between two notoriously fleet steamers was an event of vast importance. The date was set for it several weeks in advance, and from that time forward, the whole Mississippi Valley was in a state of consuming excitement. Politics and weather were dropped, and people only talked to the coming race. As the time approached, the two steamers stripped and got ready. Every encumbrance that added weight or exposed the resisting surface to wind or water was removed if the boat could possibly do without it. The spars and sometimes even the supporting derricks were sent ashore and no means left to set the boat afloat in case she got aground. No way freights and no way passengers were allowed, for the racers would stop only at the largest towns, and then it would be only touch and go. Coal flats and wood flats were contracted for beforehand, and these were kept ready to hitch on to the flying steamers at a moment's warning. Double crews were carried so that all work could be done quickly. The chosen date being come, and all things in readiness, the two great steamers backed into the stream and lay there jockeying a moment and apparently watching each other's slightest movement. Flags dropped, the pent steam shrieked through the safety valves, the black smoke rolled and tumbled from the chimneys and darkened the air. The boats were off. The shores were filled with people. The housetops, the steamboats, and every place of vantage was packed with people to welcome and cheer the racers. Brass bands played on the boats, and the people thundered huzzas from the shore. It was a grand experience when there was no bursting of boilers or running upon tearing snags. This story comes from the great state of Montana, being reported in the Anaconda Standard of July 29, 1901. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we'll see you next time on Americana Archives.